Welcome to this reading. This is Professor Smith, and I will be recording the book After Polygamy Was Made a Sin, The Social History of Christian Polygamy by John Cairncross. Polygamy was forbidden after Roman papists took over the church. Isaiah 4 tells us the Astra strongholds denying every believing woman a good husband will be overcome at the last. Enjoy, and may the Almighty Yahweh bless you. Okay, my friends, we're going to try to get through this next chapter. This is chapter 11, the plural wives. We're still talking about Mormon polygamy, or polygamy, I think more likely, since they allowed polyandry in some respect. This really has information in it. I knew some of it. I knew that this was perhaps an example of what allowing this principle in can do to the human mind, to the male unfettered fleshly desire, rather than holding with faith to what the Bible allows, which should be under strict kind of restraints. So we're going to talk about Brigham Young in this next one, and let's carry on. If Joseph Smith was a visionary of a prodigious myth-making capacity, Brigham Young was an organizer of genius. He rallied the demoralized community at Nauvoo in 1844 after Joseph's murder, led them across 1,500 miles of wilderness, and built up a prosperous and disciplined community around Salt Lake City in Utah. He was also an ascetic. His favorite food was boiled potatoes with a little buttermilk. His sole drink was water. For him, the road to salvation was not through joy, but through obedience to the commandments, however harsh, of the Lord. Sympathetic observers, such as Burton, often commenting on his judgment, penetrating and vigor, stressed his lack of warmth. His manner is cold, noted the English traveler. In fact, like his face, somewhat bloodless. His austerity extended to his sexual life. When the doctrine of plural marriage was first taught him, he desired the grave. He is credited in all with 25 wives and 56 children. But he constantly insisted that marriage was not a means to sexual gratification and that his life was pure. Many of his wives were such in name only. For example, a number of Joseph's widows, whom he had married from the sense of duty. Most of the 25, moreover, notes Werner, were sharp-faced women and not particularly decorative. The entire establishment resembled a New England household on a larger scale, but instead of one forbidding lady in blacks or grays, there were 19 of them. Sobriety and industry were the key virtues. Economy and neatness were preferred to elegance and fashionableness. His wives lived under one roof in a building called the Beehive. They did all the cooking, washing, cleaning, and waiting on tables. All of them sewed, knitted, and made homespun clothes and even carpets. When the family met for dinner, there were two tables, a short one and a long one, placed in the shape of a T. The long one being at the head of the room. At the top sat Brigham and his favorite wife. He always had a favorite. He visited each of his wives daily. They all had separate bedrooms. He always slept alone and attributed his superb constitution to the habit. Indeed, he was to assert that Joseph had introduced, quote, the best plan for restoring and establishing strength and long life among men, unquote. He regarded polygamy as the central doctrine of the church, and it was his favorite subject for a sermon. On his decision, plural marriage was first of all taught in secret to the whole community, probably during the long westward track, publicly proclaimed on the 28th, 29th of August in 1852 at Salt Lake City and governed by a code which stressed all the Puritan restraints that are to be met within Christian polygamy since the days of John of Leyden. Adultery was anathema, and the saints argued that it should be punishable by death. It is difficult to picture Brigham as building up a collection of attractive teenage brides or as adding married women to his establishment under the cover of the spiritual wife doctrine. Birth control and abortion were out of the question, as was intercourse during menstruation, pregnancy, and lactation. Husband and wife should spend the night in separate beds. Marriage was a duty, especially plural marriage, and the earlier the better. The end of the virgin was annihilation. Brigham in sermon once informed his hearers that he did not want to see any boy of 16 or girl of 14 unmarried. It is reported that the Mormons planned to introduce a bill in 1872 making marriage legal for boys of 15 and girls of 12. The purpose of marriage was procreation, not pleasure. By producing offspring, the wives contributed to their husband's elevation. They were expected to honor and serve him as their Lord. And the overall aim of polygamy was exactly the same as in Munster, to bring about the millennium. It was ordained for the purpose of raising righteous seed, that we may be restored back to that Eden from whence we fell. When the Old Testament precepts were applied to Mormon polygamy, the appropriate arguments were soon rediscovered. The saints may never have heard of Milton and Medon, but spontaneously they started to advance most of the propositions set out in these and similar minded writers. Thus, they argued that just as a husband could share his affection between several children, he was able to love a number of wives. Mormon polemicists contended that the New Testament never condemned polygamy, and that Christ clearly approved of the two egregious polygamists, such as Moses and Aaron. In some cases, the saints went even further than their predecessors. Ochino, for example, had asserted that Paul's instructions to bishops and deacons to marry one wife showed that other preachers must have had more than one. The Mormons asserted that Paul was urging Christian dignitaries to marry at least one wife. Readers note. And that is a very similar assertion to those who have studied this particular topic, that Paul's admonition to elders and bishops is that they at least be married. That they at least be married, because how are you going to demonstrate your ability to manage a household if they are not at least married? That it wasn't necessarily a glaring description of a numerical principle, which most of churchianity, in particular Catholicism and her Protestant daughters, follow today. Continuing on. In fact, some of the lines of reasoning were of exotic exuberance, such as had never previously been set on sea or land. Orson Hyde expressed the general conviction that Jesus himself had married several wives. The marriage feast at Cana was in honor of his own wedding. Had Jesus not been married to them, he wrote, in all seriousness, his intimacy with Mary and Martha and to the other Mary, also known Jesus loved, must have been highly unbecoming and improper. Christ, moreover, begat children, following in his example of his heavenly Father, who had begotten Christ by coming down to Mary without a natural body. Reader's note, that is not a completely novel interpretation. In fact, there is a particular sect in Europe that maintained that Messiah was in fact married to several women, and even some kings throughout the centuries in Europe, some kings declared that they were descendants of the literal children of Christ and his many women. Isn't that something? That is not something just concocted, but it was already claimed in areas in Europe throughout the centuries. Going on. Going even further, along this line of reasoning, the Mormons declared, quoting the old Greek writer Celsus, that one of the main reasons for the persecution of Christians by the Gentiles was that Jesus had several wives, as did some of his disciples. Mormon doctrine on the Old Testament also contains some striking innovations. Brigham Young held that Adam was a god and that Eve was only one of his wives. This does not appear to have become accepted doctrine. At any rate, when a U.S. congressman adduced the familiar argument against polygamy that Adam had only one wife, a Mormon delegate retorted that the marriage was exhaustive. Adam married all the women in the world. The arguments on the other side occasionally sound just as bizarre. The chaplain of the U.S. Senate, for example, in a public debate in 1870 at the Salt Lake City, dwelt on the fact that in the lifetime of 147 years, the patriarch Jacob had spent only 22 in polygamy. The Mormons also gradually began to discover that they had earlier and distinguished sympathizers, although they did not always get their details right. Brigham caused a certain raising of eyebrows when he referred to the illustrious bigamist, Mr. Philip Landgrave of Hesse, whose second marriage had been sanctioned by Martin Luther. secular justifications were not neglected. It was constantly pointed out that the majority of the world were polygamists, and the effectiveness of plural marriage in producing a high birth rate was an article of faith. In 1907, a Mormon guide assured Jules Hurett, a visitor to Salt Lake City, that after the next war, polygamy would have to be introduced to repair the huge losses in manpower. The populationist argument was even illustrated by a series of polygamic and monogamic problems run by the main Mormon newspaper, the Millennial Star. One example worked out that a polygamist who had married 40 wives at the age of 20 could arrive at the age of 70 with no fewer than 3,580,441 descendants. In fact, though the birth rate in Utah, for example, in 1870, when polygamy was at its height, was above the American average, it was only 23.4 per 1,000, or slightly above the figure for the western part of the country. And as far as can be ascertained, not even that if the figure is calculated per women of childbearing age. As in most polygamous societies, which include monogamous marriages, the number of children born per polygamous wife was smaller than per monogamous wife. However, much more important than the fecundity of the Mormon community is the extent to which plural marriage was adopted and accepted. The proclamation of polygamy in 1852 certainly did not produce a rift in the community, as its underground practice by the leaders had done at Nauvoo, I think that's the pronunciation. And many of the traditional restraints were removed, as at least attenuated by the sheer physical isolation of the saints hundreds of miles from the nearest settled territory. The simplest indication of support for plural marriage is the proportion of polygamous to monogamous marriages. This ratio is difficult to measure and varies considerably in time. Thus, in 1858, when the population of Utah was about 80,000, there were, according to Brokus, a federal judge stationed in Utah, 3,617 polygamous marriages, of which 1,117 involved 5 or more wives. The number of monogamous marriages is not specified. On a rough calculation, this gives a total of 16,000 polygamous spouses and a polygamous segment of at least 50,000, or well over half of the population. Werner, without specifying a date, puts the proportion of polygamous to monogamous marriages as 4-to-1, with a figure of 3-to-1 in some centers. A sociologist writing in 1875 thought that the proportion was 5-to-1. The average figure probably fluctuated, but can be taken in 1870 as being somewhere between 15% and 23%, and most probably in the neighborhood of 18%, or roughly 4-to-1. Non-Mormon sources estimated the population living in polygamy, i.e., including children, at 50%. A figure of 40% is more likely. Even such a proportion presupposes an excess of women over men, and in particular an excess of women of childbearing age over adult men, a most unusual circumstance in a frontier region, and only to be explained by the attraction of the Mormon religion to women. A fair proportion of the men must have had to live in celibacy. Polygamy was most frequent in the leading circles of the church, for it was on them that the heaviest pressure was exercised to practice it. But these husbands also tended to be the most affluent. In a theocratic society where the church owned or controlled the main sources of wealth, prosperity and religious eminence went hand in hand. Thus, polygamous marriages were both more frequent and less afflicted by economic strain in the upper crust of Mormon society. This meant, for example, that husbands in this group were usually able to provide a separate household for each wife, a great factor making for content, or at least for a diminution of discontent. Many women refused to marry if they were forced to live under the same roof as their co-wives. The men accepted this point of view and made every effort to give each wife a house. The well-to-do did so from the start. Others set up separate households as soon after their marriage as they could, but in most cases, there was no alternative to sharing. The absence of economic stress, including the provision of separate accommodation, then made for happier marriages. Out of nearly 200 families examined by Kimball Young in Isn't It One Wife Enough? Let me read that again. This is a book it's referencing. Out of nearly 200 families examined by Kimball Young in, and this is the title of the book, Isn't One Wife Enough? 53% were successful, 25% reasonably so. The rest showed considerable or severe conflict. Nearly a half was in the upper income bracket or above average. 1/3 was moderately comfortable. 1/6 was average, and the rest poor. However, there was a sharp difference between the men's reaction and the women's. Most of the men had no difficulty in adjusting to the new system. One of the anti-Mormon writers, who claims to have been working in London for the cause when Mormon polygamy was announced, makes merry over the spectacle of a 70-year-old pastor, married but childless, declaring solemnly that the doctrine should be prayerfully considered, unquote. And she wonders how he would have reacted if the church had come out in favor of polyandry instead of polygamy. Readers note, the text is assuming that the definition for polygamy is, in fact, the more restricted definition of polygyny, because words and their meanings change over time. That's semantic change. So apparently in this case, the term polygamy is strictly contextualized among a man with plurality of wives rather than the other way around. Therefore, they make a distinction in this text between polyandry and polygamy. But it should be noted that today, in what is the most up-to-date sociological kinds of definitions, polygamy includes polyandry. It's a generalized term, and therefore, many people who believe in being precise in the declaration of, say, the principle from Scripture, they use the term polygyny, which is what sociologists have adapted for strictly a man having a plurality of wives, not the other way around. Continuing on. The main and explicit appeal of celestial marriage was, of course, to the desire of the men for exaltation in life to come and the knowledge that they held the key to their wife's glory. But at the same time, the practice offered very real advantages in the present life. The Mormons never admitted as much, but many of them must have been aware of the sexual variationism permitted by polygamy in spite of the restrictions imposed by the official sexual code. It was not only Brigham Young who felt rejuvenated when from time to time he got a dashing young bride, quote unquote. Economic factors also made the new doctrine attractive to the men. Female labor was practically unobtainable in Utah, and when it was extremely expensive. The Mormon farmer or housekeeper had therefore every interest to marry his Abigail, who thereby usually became an unpaid or at least self-supporting assistant. All these facets of the patriarchal marriage sparkle in the following jewel by a Mormon leader, and this is a quote. A man who has but one wife and is inclined to that doctrine soon begins to wither and dry up, while a man who goes into plurality looks fresh, young, and sprightly. Why is this? Because God loves the man and he honors his word and work. For a man of God to be confined to one woman is small business. I do not know what we should do if we had only one wife apiece, unquote. But, as always, there were two sides to the question. Even Brigham Young had his peck of troubles. At the age of 61, he fell in love with and married a beautiful actress called Amelia Folsom, who, says one writer, quote, proved a pretty handful, defying Brigham in her house, a separate one in her exceptional case, and generally domineering him, unquote. She even, as it is alleged, once threatened to thrash him unless he carried out her instructions. Another wife, seeing that he was tiring of her, asked him to seal her to Christ for eternity. Even Brigham found this request excessive and persuaded her to make do with Joseph Smith. Another wife sued him for divorce when he was 74, but he astutely pleaded that, by United States law, she was not his legal wife. She promptly shook the dust of Utah off her feet and became an anti-Mormon speaker and writer. Her main work wife number 19, in fact, she was number 27, is largely composed of emotional outbursts against polygamy. One turns from her pages, says the impartial Werner. Let me read that again. One turns from her pages, says the impartial Werner, more than ever sympathetic with the trials of Brigham Young. Readers know, isn't that something? That even the what would be the detractors of this principle would find such a treatise, well, such a, I guess that's not the correct term, but it's, a writing by a scorned woman or a woman who felt like she didn't get her way or whatever the reasons were. She really poured her emotional self into it, and it was not very well received, even among those who don't accept the principle. Such stains must have been reproduced on a far wider scale, or strains rather. Such strains must have been reproduced on a far wider scale. The effort of keeping peace between discontented wives and of providing for the upkeep of hordes of children often became acute. One Mormon wife even asserted that if polygamy was a trial for the women, it was an even greater cross for the men. Polygamy was also in some ways a severe trial for those with a single wife, and even more for those with none. There was a tendency from the start for the older, wealthier, and more firmly established men to monopolize the girls coming on the marriage market. Burton noted in 1859 that the women would rather be the 15th ceiling of Dives than the toilsome single wife of Lazarus, quote unquote. There was also a danger of a young man backsliding, whereas a middle-aged patriarch with 4 or 5 wives under his care was fixed for life. Hence, women, dreading a possible renegade with the terrible consequences of a heavenless future for themselves, are shy of saying yes to a youth. That this was no Gentile calumny is proved by Brigham Young himself, who in 1868 appealed to young men, quote, to take themselves wives of the daughters of Zion and not wait for us old men to take them all, unquote. Practical as ever, he urged the girls to, quote, tell the young men that you will sustain yourselves and teach them how to sustain themselves if they do not know how. In fact, there appears to have been an evolution in the situation. Originally, the accepted code laid it down that married men were for young girls if no suitor was in the offing. This was fair enough, since girls were regarded as old maids at 25, and the men felt it imperative to see that they were married, if only to ensure their salvation. As time went on, but the evidence is vague as to the actual dates, a pattern emerged, which made it incumbent upon polygamous suitors to withdraw when a single man had already established courtship relations with a young woman. But not all men were so fortunate as to establish such relations. A sizable slice of the male population had to get along without a wife, the inevitable counterpart of a situation where some men had several. The only consolation in the case of the Mormons appears to have been that the underprivileged section gradually diminished as the system settled down and the young men no longer felt overawed by their olders and betters. The women, for their part, even if almost always provided with a husband, often found it difficult to adjust to polygamy. As one Mormon wife put it, women would never have accepted polygamy had it not been for their religion, unquote. For that very reason, however, their trials were tempered by a faith which gave them a moral strength rare in our unbelieving age. No cross, no crown was their slogan, and it is utterly misleading to look solely at the cross without mentioning the promised crown. Many of them suffered in silence, and their hostility to the system therefore went unrecorded. The feelings of many of them, however, may be deduced from the frequent fulminations of Brigham Young. He was always reproaching the wives with grumbling, and even with preventing their husbands, sometimes bishops and elders, from taking another wife. And Brigham usually concluded his strictures on the women by assuring them that they would be damned unless they mended their ways. When it comes to striking a balance between resistance to and acceptance of polygamy, it is almost impossible to disentangle the general from the specific factors. For one thing, life on the frontier was hard for everyone. As against this, the Mormons formed a tightly knit community which was almost unique in the ruthless laissez faire 19th century in providing in embryo many of the facilities of the modern welfare state. Then again, the sexual inferiority of women and the neglect for some of their interests were common to Puritan circles, especially working class and agrarian circles, where a patriarchal mode of life prevailed. The main problem was, of course, jealousy between the wives. Most visitors made much of the resultant tensions. Hubner, a French diplomat traveling through the Utah in 1871, for example, noted that the husbands were generally accompanied by two and sometimes three wives, of which the youngest was the favorite and on whom the men concentrated all his affection. The other or others looked on sulkily. There were arguments as to who had the hardest cross to bear, the first wife who had often been married under a monogamous system, or the subsequent wives who entered the household as additional members of it. By and large, both categories had their trials. But since, unlike in traditional polygamous societies, the material and personal rights of each wife were not codified and there was no time for a new set of rules to emerge, the whole weight of the existing American legislation and of the carryover of monogamic prejudices combined to give the first wife a higher status. She tended to disdain her polygamous sisters, and her animosity was reciprocated. This tension came to a head wherever there was any question of inheritance. The Mormons would have liked to legislate in order to provide for equality of treatment as between the wives and all the children, but they were prevented from doing so, particularly from 1887 on, when polygamy was being forced out of existence. Thus, the division of property by federal legislation became the symbol of status. This ban imposed by the central government contributed to tension in polygamous families, especially on the death of the father. In half of the cases investigated by Kimball Young, there was satisfaction as to the outcome, in the other half, not. Often families simply disintegrated, he notes, when the head died, into groups of conflicting persons. This, regardless of how well he had directed his property. Another issue which gave rise to acute strain was the tendency, already mentioned, of older men to take their pick of the young girls. This practice was bad enough for the older wives, but it was perhaps even more serious for those of the girls who arrived in Utah without any relatives and who were pressured into marriage with a man old enough to be her grandfather without realizing what was involved. Both problems became less obsessive as the system found its feet. So much for the tribulations of the women. But there was also a brighter side. There was a number of Mormon wives who, quote, accepted polygamy as the comforting principle and were happy in its practice, unquote. In some marriages, there were scenes which could only be explained by a deep affection for the husband. The case of Brigham Young can hardly be regarded as typical. All the same, some of the details of his life are worth a mention. An English immigrant aspired to be his wife and served him for 7 years when promised that marriage would reward her efforts. Brigham kept his word, and she lived on contentedly in the beehive as his wife. When the prophet was ill, too, there were affecting scenes. The greater part of the wives, who were rigorously prohibited from approaching his bedroom, would rush restless and anxious to his antechamber in the hopes of being able to cast through the half-open door a furtive look of affection. And the annals of Mormon life in the last century, especially during the persecution of the sect in the 80s, are full of the devotion in word and act of Mormon wives for their husbands. But the real proof that jealousy was often overcome lies in the constant cooperation between co-wives over the difficulties of everyday life. Sometimes they worked together to obtain something from the husband which their individual efforts would not have extracted, but usually cooperation was in the work. One pair of wives commented on, quote, the comfort to a simple family there was in having two wives to lighten the labors and duties of the household, unquote. Polygamy afforded the women mutual help in childbearing, in sickness, and in tending to the children. Thus, the baby of a wife who had died would be suckled by another wife who also had a baby, while the children of a dead wife would be brought up by another wife who was childless. It can well be believed that Mormon women were sincere when they quoted, as they often did, the motto, the more the merrier. The difficulties were not glossed over, however. Plurge marriage had been a severe trial, said one of the women, but it had also proved one of the greatest blessings. In short, polygamous marriages were often happier than the alleged peaceful looks like menages of monogamous England. And also, to judge from several contemporary books by serious authors denouncing the subjection and degradation of women in their country, then many a marriage in France. Then many a marriage in France. Cooperation was particularly close in marriages to a pair of sisters. Kimball Young calculated that 19% of polygamous husbands married sisters. But the percentage no doubt varied as between one period and another. This sororal polygamy appears to have sent contemporaries into convulsions, and even greater horror was aroused by marriages to mother and daughter. The fact is that, to judge by a similar trend among the Munsterites, polygamy leads to the relaxation on the taboo on incest. Marriages in Utah between first cousins were frequent, and Brigham Young went so far as to tell a visitor, Hepworth Dixon, that marriage between brother and sister was not prohibited by the Mormon Church, but by prejudice. What was more, also as in the days of the Munsterites, wives often went out and found additional wives for their husbands. Thus, when a fresh convoy of immigrants arrived, those women who wanted extra wives or who wanted a husband for themselves went down to the camping ground. The reason for such an initiative was concern for the women's exaltation in the afterlife. As one of them put it, "Do you suppose that I shall be satisfied to be the wife of a man who could not exalt me in the celestial kingdom? A man with only one wife? Why, I have often told my husband that if he did not get other wives, I would leave. It is necessary for a man to have two wives at least if he would enter into the celestial kingdom. That is why I have been so anxious to get wives for my husband." And one wife lamented bitterly at being unable to prevail on young girls to marry her husband. Some wives were prompted to intervene because they had no children. There is a case of a barren wife lining up children by other wives and showing them off. Lastly, the wives sometimes found a new wife in order to forestall an unsuitable choice or even a good choice at an unsuitable time on the part of the husband. Readers note, that is fascinating right there, that little part. Let me read that again. Some wives were prompted to intervene because they had no children. There is a case of a barren wife lining up children by other wives and showing them off. Lastly, the wives sometimes found a new wife in order to forestall an unsuitable choice or even a good choice at an unsuitable time on the part of the husband. Isn't that something? That the wives themselves, rather than leaving the choice up to the husband, they would sometimes imagine the psychological implications here. A woman might choose a less attractive woman such that she might maintain the supremacy in the heart of her husband, lest she allow a husband to be left to his own devices and find perhaps a prettier wife than her. Imagine that one. This is very interesting. The strange thing is that there are so many sociological implications in all of this. And myself, as having one of my degrees in the sociology, is to me, it's very fascinating how the relationships work out and so on. Continuing on. But it was not only cooperation that kept polygamous women's morale high. Since the husband was frequently absent on a missionary tour or was spending a quota of his time with his other wives, women were thrown back on themselves. The system thus tended to enhance the mother's role in child rearing and in family controls generally. In 44 families studied by Kimball Young, there were 3 families where the father set the basic pattern, 13 where the father was dominant, but the mother had considerable authority, 11 where there was a relatively equal distribution, and 17 where the wives were absolutely dominant. Readers note, this also has been noted in other kinds of records. See, here's the thing. Women today, they think that monogamy is assuring their domination of a husband. But the simple fact is that When women become very attuned to the system, they use their feminine wiles and use the numbers. In other words, um, what's the term where you basically you convince perhaps other wives or other women to align with your views, and in that way you present a united bloc against what you perceive to be the designs of your husband that you don't want to happen, you see. And so you might have a man might experience two or three wives that are in alignment against his designs, and in particular, if those designs perhaps were perceived by all these women in agreement that they might be destructive toward the peace and well-being of the household. You see the self-regulatory aspect from a sociological standpoint here. Continuing on. In the same way, there was a tendency for the children's attachment to the mother to increase and for the mother's affection to be concentrated on the children when her feelings for the husband had vanished or declined. A woman in polygamy, said one wife, is compelled by her lone position to make a confidant of her children. Hence, wives developed an independence unknown in monogamous days. And so, strangely enough, still as with the German Anabaptists, women, though in some respects man's unequal, became in practice their equals. As O'Day says, Mormonism early came very close to accepting the equality of women with men. In fact, Joseph Smith, with unpatriarchal attitudes, did not countenance any overlordship on man's part. And he saw to it that, as O'Day says in Modern American, the auxiliary organizations of the church activated women to an extent that makes them feel very part of the church. Very interesting, reader's note. Even under the less elastic rule of Brigham Young, women were not regarded as basically inferior to women. In the church, she rated equally with her husband. She contributed to his glory by forming one of his band of wives. As a married woman, she could hold property in her own name, an unusual privilege in those days. In a community which attached the utmost value of formal schooling, she was given equal opportunities for education. Girls, as always noted, were urged by Brigham Young to make the first advances in persuading reluctant bachelors to marry them. They had recourse, as Kimball Young says Kimball Young. Let me read that again. They had recourse, says Kimball Young, not only to romantic devices to snare a man, but in some cases were much more direct, unquote. In those days, said the daughter of a bishop, who was much sought after, when a woman wanted to marry a man, the man felt it was his duty to marry her. Above all, women were not condemned to a cloistered existence in their homes. Kimball Young notes that, quote, the whole position of women, though secondary to men in theory, was in fact relatively high compared to the position of women in other pioneer societies. Women worked out of the home in various kinds of jobs. It often represented their emancipation from the traditional position as housekeeper. The telegraph operators were women, sometimes single, sometimes married. They were often teachers and sometimes managers of extensive properties of their husbands, especially when the husband was away on mission. Brigham Young insisted that women should be self-supporting, starting with his own wives. He even urged girls to take the lead in showing impractical young men how they could support themselves and thus overcome their reluctance to take a wife. He held that women make just as good mathematicians and accountants as any man and could do the business of any county house. Many of the women plied their own trade. A work on the Mormons dated 1874 wrote that in some respects you would think these people the most forward of the age. They closed no career on a woman in Utah, unquote. Readers know, very interesting information, isn't it? It's almost like the presentation is suggesting that the ultimate feminine liberation is, in fact, being invested and working within the confines of the principle. The principle, I mean, by the adoption and acceptance of polygamy, a man having more than one wife. Very interesting indeed. Thus, Mormon women were, as one of them claimed, educated to self-government. This was no mere metaphor. Women exercised the vote at a time when feminine suffrage smacked of lunacy. They were, it is true, granted this right only as a result of a comedy of errors. In 1870, Congress passed a bill to give women the vote, which, though ostensibly designed for all American territories, those areas not yet admitted to statehood, was really meant to discourage polygamy in Utah. Washington imagined that the downtrodden women of Salt Lake City would seize the opportunity to regain their liberty. To general surprise, the Mormon delegate backed the bill. The Utah legislature implemented it, and in 1872, the women voted solidly for the Mormon candidate. Reader's note here. This is just my opinion, okay? I think it may have been a mistake because you see the domino. One thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. If it so be that the domino effect was at play here, what I mean is that the women using their accumulative power to get men to do what they want, either in household or in community united, that the long-term goal may well have been getting out of the system. And that appears to be what happened historically. Therefore, this has been a caution I have proffered before. Men, though the administration when in the house should be left to the wife, obviously, they should not allow that first domino to fall within the voting area, because that then becomes government. That then becomes arrangement. That then translates to policy. And we see the decline of this principle. And my opinion here, I believe that the first domino was allowing the women to vote. So that was a weakness. That was a weakness on the part of that husband. Never should have done that. And or husbands, because basically the entire thing blew up. That's why I say that the principle has to be under very rigid restraints in that sense as well. Continuing on. Eastern feminists, in their desire to free their Mormon sister, joined hands with other anti-polygamy groups to achieve the repeal. In 1887, a women's suffrage. This disenfranchisement was vigorously opposed by the victims. The ballot in the hands of women is a mighty power, and our foes know it, declares one of the speakers at a demonstration of protest at Salt Lake City in 1886, just before the blow fell. And at that meeting, a poem insisted that polygamy was merely a pretext for an attack on the Mormon religion, was greeted with vociferous applause. Let me read that again. That was kind of a confusing thing there. The ballot in the hands of women is a mighty power, and our foes know it, declaimed one of the speakers at a demonstration of protest in Salt Lake City in 1886, just before the blow fell. And at that meeting, a poem insisting that polygamy was merely a pretext for an attack on the Mormon religion was greeted with vociferous applause, unquote. Women were seriously convinced that the way to their emancipation lay through the patriarchal order. The belief was forcefully, if inelegantly stated in a poem written in 1884. And here's the poem. Too long has haughty and preclusive pride the meed of woman's worthiness denied. 'Tis finished, hark! The thrilling battle cry of women's rights now rends the echoing sky. End quote. Reader's note here. So my hypothesis in the domino theory was at that time even declared by opponents to the notion that women should be given the right to vote. There were men who could see ahead into the future. They could understand the domino theory of nature. And so this was really the death knell of the acceptance of the principle. Continuing on. And just as they refused to agitate themselves out of the vote, they left without occupants a huge home for Mormon wives founded in the 1880s in the expectation that it would provide a haven for polygamous wives escaping from their husband's tyranny. The building finally had to be closed down for want of custom. Strong in their faith, the Mormon women were considered themselves as artists in marriage and regarded the Gentile women as uninitiated lay critics whose opinions were worthy only of condescending pity. In the same way, and with considerable justification, they felt that their conditions of life were far superior to those of the corresponding classes in the countries from which they had come, and indeed to those in most parts of America. There are scathing references in their writing to the bestial conditions of men, and especially women, who work 17 hours a day almost naked in sweltering mines and coke furnaces. The Gentile women were to some extent excusable for their errors of judgment. They were misled by the flood of lurid exposés of Mormon sex life poured out in the eastern states. But women were to the fore in the production of such, looks like Schund literature, it's a German term, and even more so in the fanaticism with which they crusaded for the suppression of plural marriage. As Burton observed, when the fair sex enters upon the subject of polygamy, it apparently loses all sense of self-control, not to say it senses. The favorite plot in these colorful works was that the poor English orphan lured out to Utah and dying of a broken heart when she discovers the sordid reality. The best known work of its kind is called Female Life Among the Mormons, or How I Escaped from the Mormons by Maria Ward, who had in fact never lived in Utah. It was first published in 1855 and ran through numerous editions. It was even translated into French under the titillating title of Les Harems de Nouveau Monde. So it looks like the harems in Nauvoo. I'm not sure what the Monday is. You'd have to look that up. In this work, women in Utah are represented either as the sexual slaves of the rich or exploited labor among the poor. Rich or poor, they had no rights, and they were savagely punished for the most trifling offense or revelation. Relegation to the cellar was the mildest penalty. More often, the women were given the lash. When they were so rash as to condemn polygamy, they were abducted, scourged, and their mouth and tongue seared. Rich old men monopolized the young girls, some of whom were only 12, who were traded like so much cattle by their fathers. Women related one such heartless father to a prospective customer, quote, are much more active and industrious than the men, quite apart from the delectation of their society, unquote. And the book is adorned with enlightening illustrations showing women plowing while the men stand by and loaf. Nor did the distortion apply only to sexual practices. After 1852, writes Werner, and here's the quote, it became the general opinion in the eastern states that polygamists were some species of beast, not at all resembling other forms of humanity, except in general deceptive appearance. We find this attitude even applied to the offspring of polygamous parents. Mr. Hart was the son of polygamous parents, wrote an American gentleman in Memoirs of My Day, and yet he was a most exemplary, intelligent, companionable young gentleman. The anti-Mormon propaganda fell on fertile soil. Public opinion and the federal government were soon convinced that Mormonism spelled polygamy, and polygamy spelled the enslavement of women. Polygamy soon became the mark of peculiarity around which the energies of both contending parties converged. The government felt entitled to intervene, and intervene they did, exactly as in the case of the Munsterites. For 3 generations, says Fawn Brodie, America tried to legislate polygamy out of existence in Mormon territory, sending the leading elders to the penitentiary like common criminals. But both the men and women, sublimely certain of the rightness of their cause, fought the nation with astonishing tenacity. As early as 1851, that is, even before polygamy had been officially proclaimed, Utah's request for statehood, to which its population entitled it, was met with a torrent of abuse. In 1857, war with the federal government over this issue was narrowly averted. In 1862, Vice President Colfax told Brigham Young that the government did not intend to intervene beyond demanding the abolition of polygamy. The same year, President Lincoln signed the first anti-polygamy bill, and Brigham Young was brought to trial under its provisions, but acquitted by a Mormon court, quote, for lack of evidence, unquote, as the official record says, without a trace of irony. In 1871, at the age of 70, he was again to be charged, this time with lascivious cohabitation. By the end of the 70s, the Gentile population in Utah had increased substantially, and the opinion in the whole country had been aroused against the saints over their marriage system. The Methodist and other Puritan denominations were to the fore in the campaign. Ulysses Grant was adamant that licensed immorality must be abolished. Pressure was stepped up by further punitive measures in 1882 and 1887. Elders were sent to the penitentiary in batches. There were 572 convictions for plural marriage, and perhaps over $1 million worth of property, equal to a far higher figure today, had been taken away from the disincorporated church. Most of the leaders went underground. The Mormons claimed that the United States Constitution guaranteed freedom of opinion and religion, and hence that Congress had no right to legislate on marriage. The anti-Mormons fell back on far-fetched analogies, such as the practice of suttee, in which Indian widows threw themselves on their husband's funeral pyre. Brigham Young was more to the point when he asked a hostile senator, then why not legislate about the intercourse of the sexes, unquote. And in a sermon he asked, quote, why does not our government make a law to say how many children a man may have? The Mormons also made great play with the tolerance of polygamy in what were then the British colonies. The church's president, Taylor, pointed to the millions of polygamists protected by the law in India and elsewhere and concluded, it's very unfortunate that our Republican government cannot be generous to its provinces as a monarchical government can be to its colonies. And here is something here. Some of the measures make strange reading. Polygamists were disenfranchised, but brothel keepers and their associates were allowed to vote. The Utah legislation divided up the time a man had cohabitated with more than one woman into as little as weeks, and several bills of indictment were found for each segment of time. It was not necessary to show that intercourse had taken place or was taking place. Here's the quote. The 1882 measures, says Bancroft in his History of Utah, rank among the clumsiest specimens of legislations as yet devised by man. But it remained for the Edmunds Bill to cap the climax of absurdity by virtually setting aside the statute of limitations and providing for the punishment of persons living at any time with other than legal wives. Bigamy, polygamy, and unlawful cohabitation were classed together. The bill virtually proposes to disenfranchise a people and to govern them by a committee of 5 men. The American humorist Mark Twain was even more savage. In a letter of 1885, he exclaimed, quote, consider the complacent cant about this country of ours, being the home of liberty of conscience. It seems that the attitude of our Congress and people toward the Mormon church is a matter of limitless laughter and derision, unquote. The saints held out, but it was a losing battle. In spite of fresh revelations, one of them so late as 1889, urging them to cling to polygamy, their fervor began to flag. And finally, on the 24th of September, 1890, a manifesto, not a revelation, was read out to the church authorities by their president, Wilford Woodruff, who denied in the most solemn manner that the charges of polygamy preferred against the church had any foundation and declared the Mormons' intention to submit to the government's anti-polygamy laws. It was the end. A small fundamentalist movement dissented and still dissents, affording rich material for muckraking authors, while the difficult transition between polygamy and monogamy was also turned to account for them. The same fundamentalists argue that Woodruff had merely meant to temporize, that he proposed to send missionaries to other countries in order to keep plural marriage alive, and once statehood had been granted, to ignore Washington's orders, as other regions had done on acquiring statehood, and introduce its own marriage laws. Whatever the truth, Woodruff was forced in 1891 to prohibit plural marriages in any part of the globe in order to get back the church's property. The Mormons were rewarded for their docility by the grant of statehood in 1896 and by a bill delegitimizing all children born of polygamous marriages up to 1906. With the passage of time, the forced conversion to orthodoxy became deep-seated conviction. Nowadays, notes Brody, the Mormon hierarchy, in its passion for respectability, has so turned against the principle and the practice that it has heaped on the fundamentalists all the self-righteous fury and abhorrence to the Gentiles that the Gentiles had spent on the Mormons only a generation before. Memories of the tradition still crop up occasionally. In 1966, a Salt Lake City doctor pleaded the cause of polygamy for old people on the ground that old people do not know how to look after themselves, that old women will never eat properly if they have to prepare the food only for themselves, that there is a marked disproportion between the two sexes over 60. Outside Utah, the battle has long been forgotten, but memories survive in the provision of the United States Immigration Act, which informs intended visitors that no visa will be granted to aliens who are polygamists or who practice polygamy or advocate the practice of polygamy. It was one of these curious anarchisms that linger on, like a fly embedded in amber. It is, however, an unfortunate reminder of the not-so-far-sighted policy pursued by the federal government. The Mormons may have been wrong in trying to put the clock back, and their exclusive self-righteousness was a consistent irritant to the rest of the country. But they were entitled to their beliefs. Had Washington adopted a less militant line, the smiles of the Gentiles, quote unquote, the advent of the railways, and the urbanization of the community would doubtless have proved a far more effective and gentle solvent for the saints' unorthodox practices. But where sexual customs are concerned, such fierce passions are aroused that it is useless to appeal to reason. And now we have a section called An Ally to the Mormons. Contemporaneous with Mormonism and largely on the same wavelength of ideas was a current inspired by Christian missionaries who had come into contact with the Moors of the non-European world. In the 19th century, Protestant missions were expanding rapidly, and many a preacher was forced by the customs in his parish to reflect deeply and earnestly on his own convictions. They looked at the Old Testament text more closely, and the study awakened slumbering patriarchal traditions in their hearts and minds. They found it more and more difficult to defend a rigid stance toward their flocks when confronted with incontrovertible evidence that polygamy had been countenanced by Jehovah among his chosen people. And they came to realize that by forcing a convert to repudiate all his wives but one, they were helping to dissolve the moral fabric of the community, forcing the husband to indulge in a shameful breach of a solemn covenant, and thrusting the discarded wives into vice, if not into prostitution. The result of such soul-searching is a series of decisions and findings which may come as a shock to those who still regard the Victorian age as an unfeeling, monolithic block of orthodoxy. Burton, always a sympathizer with polygamy, and admittedly not in the Puritan tradition, notes in 1861 that Colenso, the Bishop of Natal, not only tolerated polygamy in converts, but defended it on the ground of religion and humanity, unquote. In 1884, a conference of missionaries of various denominations meeting in Calcutta, including the Church of Scotland and the American Presbyterian Board, unanimously agreed that if a convert, before becoming a Christian, has married more wives than one, in accordance with the practice of the Jewish and primitive Christian churches, he should be permitted to keep them all. But such a person shall not be eligible to any office in the church. Similar views have been recorded in the case of U.S. missionaries in China, and even a certain Reverend William Brown, the historian of missions in America, expresses willingness to tolerate polygamy among the converts in a work which probably dates from the end to the last century. However, none of these missionaries, as far as known, carried this conversion to the point of propagating his new convictions in print, least of all in his home country. The only writers to go so far was an American using the pseudonym of, quote, a Christian philanthropist, in a work entitled The History and Philosophy of Marriage, or Polygamy and Monogamy Compared. The work was published in Boston in 1869 and ran to a second edition in 1875, and apparently even to a third one. All that is known of the writer is that he was a New Englander, was brought up as a strict Puritan, and wanted to become a missionary, but after a breakdown was sent abroad as a clerk, later becoming a factor, in the trading post of a Boston company which had extensive business connections with India. It was while employed in this capacity that he learned from certain American missionaries of the problems raised by local plural marriage and of the willingness of certain churches to countenance the retention among converts of a plurality of wives. At first, he sought to remonstrate with the clerics, but he was soon persuaded that there was scripture for their views. And in the end, he decided to carry war into the enemy's camp by composing his book. Like almost all his predecessors, he does not realize that he is part of a long tradition. He is unaware that any former attempt has been made in the USA to analyze and explain the social system of polygamy, and that any works written for this purpose have ever been current in America. It was only after his manuscript was ready for the press that he discovered Maiden's Thelephlothora. That's a difficult word to pronounce, is it? Thelephlothora, from which he quotes an appendix in his second edition. And it is significant that he constantly quotes Milton, even without realizing that Milton shared his views, and frequently adduces the very passages where the poet has covertly confessed his polygamous convictions. Conversely, it is strange that at no point does the author appear to be aware of the Mormons' campaign for plural marriage, although controversy on that score was already raging throughout the USA. Needless to say, his book was given an enthusiastic reception by the Latter-day Saints as being, quote, a fearless and unprejudiced study, unquote. In presenting his case, the philanthropist urged his audience to grant him a fair hearing. Most travelers, he says rightly, carry their native prejudices abroad and look upon the customs of distant countries with less admonishment than contempt. He emphasizes that polygamy has always prevailed in most countries and in all ages of the world from time immemorial. He insists that marriage ought to be possible to all, yet it is denied to millions of women. In part, this is because male mortality is higher in the reproductive ages than in women, and in part because many men refuse marriage. In England, he asserts at the time of the most recent census, less than 1/3 of marriageable women were living in marriage. This absolute state of affairs is due to monogamy, a cruel and oppressive system, quote unquote. Yet, the amorous passions of men are stronger than those of women. There are many women whose vitality is such that they cannot be content with only one wife. Hence, monogamy makes chastity and religion to be hated. Polygamy would even out both excesses. Let me read that again. Polygamy would even out both excesses, giving the surplus women a husband and his more vigorous men additional wives, giving the surplus women a husband and the more vigorous men additional wives. Not only so, polygamy was approved by God in the case of the patriarchs and was practiced at the time of Christ's event throughout Judea and Galilee, and in all the other countries of Asia and Africa, without doubt by some of his own disciples, unquote. That, and let me put a reader's note here. We've seen that before. Now, can you imagine any modern church teaching the truth on that today? They would never. They would never. They hide this information from people. And that's one of the reasons why I like to get this information out of into the domain. But the idea that even some of Messiah's own disciples had more than one wife, now the modern mind considers it inconceivable. But the truth is, the reality is that in fact, it was the case. Continuing on. The custom is never included in the long list of offenses denounced in the New Testament. If John the Baptist reproached King Herod, it was with adultery, since Herod had married his brother's wife while the latter was still living, and not with polygamy, although the king had 9 wives at the time. If the writer continues, the church today insists on monogamy. This is the result of a grievous deviation traceable to pernicious Gnostic influences. For the Gnostics condemned the body as evil and were obsessed with celibacy. They gained the upper hand in the church some 2 centuries after Christ and had left their stamp on its practices ever since. Like all good Puritan polygamists, the author is resolutely opposed to divorce, birth control, and of course to abortion and the sale of abortifacients, since the earth is still not replenished and not subdued. And he quotes Milton, "Our Maker bids increase." Most great men, he contends, have been covert polygamists. Goethe, Byron, Napoleon, but they had not gone far enough, since they have not explicitly defended polygamy. But the main benefactors from polygamy, from plurality, let me read that again. But the main benefactors from plurality will be women. The author denies that the practice gives rise to jealousy, that vice thrives most luxuriantly when, quote, the other woman is loved in secret. Open polygamy destroys the evil at the root. Polygamy is not degrading for women. What is really brutish and vicious is the prostitution and also the frustration that flow from monogamy through the inability of so many millions of women to marry. In fact, he is at times positively feminist. In a telling sentence, he notes, quote, "It is a just complaint against men that they have too long kept the women in subjection and ignorance, first withholding from them the key of knowledge, and then charging them with incapacity for many responsible duties and employments." It is a fitting note on which to end a century-old current of thought. And that completes our reading for today. Very fascinating. A lot of this information I really didn't know about Brigham Young, but it appears that Brigham Young wanted to create quite a departure from the excesses and from the moral turpitude of which Joseph Smith engaged in. It's clear to see that he wanted to purify the Mormon church and get rid of the adultery, get rid of the polyandry. He wanted it to be far more of a conservative practice. The only failure I can see is that particular patriarchs within Brigham Young's um, sphere of influence basically made the fatal mistake of women's suffrage, which led to their voting bloc, which we can see today. Think about it. Women have been given the right to vote. And what have they done with that authority? What have they done? They have made great strides to make murdering their babies acceptable. They have gone so far as to transing their children, as we see openly today. They have upheld absolute abominations, LGBTQ, and the churches who have allowed women into the pulpit, it is not long before they allow the gays and the lesbians practicing as such into the pulpit, including trans. And we see that all over the place. And of course, this obviously my analysis here, but the fatal error was giving them state power through their voting bloc, because they are by nature group creatures. And if there was one that has an idea that they can get behind, the whole group of them do. You see, it's not that I dislike women. I love women, obviously, but I also understand the nature as such. And that's what I see that the failure of Brigham Young was. So that concludes our reading, and that's just my, of course, this is just my opinion on some things, but obviously this issue is resurfacing significantly in our latter day, and it behooves us to pay attention as well. And so with that, I thank you all, and I bid you shalom, shalom.